The sun burned low over the dusty horizon, casting long shadows across the small frontier town. Wagons creaked along the rutted road, and townsfolk gathered near the general store to watch the day's only excitement, a coach rattling its way into town. Dust billowed behind it, and children ran alongside, laughing and pointing, their bare feet scattering pebbles across the dry ground. For most, the arrival of the stagecoach meant news, supplies, or letters from loved ones. But for one woman, aboard, it meant something more, something final. She stepped down slowly, her gloved hands trembling as they clutched a battered satchel. Her bonnet was tilted awkwardly, and strands of golden brown hair clung damply to her cheeks. Her eyes, red-rimmed from weeping, darted about in desperate hope, searching the crowd for a face she had only seen in a single faded photograph. Somewhere, among these strangers, her husband-to-be was supposed to be waiting, but no one came forward. The coach driver tipped his hat politely, lifted her trunk onto the dirt street, and climbed back onto his seat. With a sharp crack of the whip, the horses lurched forward, pulling the coach out of town. Dust rose once more, and in its wake, the young woman was left standing alone, her satchel in one hand, her trunk at her feet, and her tears beginning anew. A murmur spread through the crowd. That must be the mail-order bride. Poor thing. Didn't you hear? He's gone north. Ain't coming back. The whispers struck her like blows. Her breath caught in her throat. The letter she had clung to all these weeks, the promise of marriage, of safety, of a new beginning, crumbled in her chest like ash. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back a sob, but the tears betrayed her. They spilled freely, hot and unashamed, as she turned away from the crowd. The men shifted uncomfortably, some spitting into the dirt, others sneering at her foolishness. A few women shook their heads, pity in their eyes but no compassion in their steps. To them, she was already a burden, another mouth to feed, another lost soul who didn't belong. She dragged her trunk to the edge of the street, each step heavy as though her boots were filled with stone. Finally, she sank onto the wooden boardwalk in front of the saloon, clutching her satchel to her chest like it was the only friend she had left in the world. Her tears fell onto the worn leather, darkening the surface in uneven spots. Inside the saloon, laughter and music carried on as if her misery were invisible. Men played cards, slammed whiskey glasses, and sang off-key, oblivious to the girl outside, breaking apart in silence. She pulled her bonnet lower, hiding her face from the curious stares of passers-by. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the earth and never rise again. But not everyone turned away. From across the street, a man stood, apart from the rest, broad-shouldered, his dark hair braided back, a fringed leather shirt resting against his strong frame. He leaned against the post of the livery stable, silent, his deep-set eyes fixed on her. Unlike the others, he did not whisper. He did not laugh. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, though there was something in the stillness of his gaze, something that seemed to understand. She did not notice him yet, but he noticed her. And as the last of the daylight slipped behind the mesas, the Apache warrior knew that the woman's story was only beginning. The evening settled heavy upon the town, the heat of the day giving way to a cool desert breeze. Still, the young woman sat alone on the boardwalk, her trunk beside her, her bonnet tilted low. Every sound around her, the rattle of wagon wheels, the jingle of spurs, the rowdy laughter spilling from the saloon, seemed to remind her she didn't belong. Her fingers tightened around the satchel on her lap. Inside were the letters, folded and worn from her long journey. Letters filled with promises. Promises of a home, of protection, of a husband who would care for her after she'd lost everything back east. The man's handwriting had been rough, but kind. He had written of his small cabin near the edge of the settlement, of needing a companion, someone to build a life with in this wild place. But where was he? She swallowed against the lump in her throat, rising to her feet. Gathering what courage she had, she approached a group of townsfolk standing near the post office. Her voice shook as she asked, "Excuse me, I'm looking for Mr. Jameson. He was supposed to meet me here. Do any of you know where I might find him?" A silence fell over the group. The men exchanged looks, and one woman, a sharp-eyed matron with her hands on her hips, let out a long sigh. "Honey," the woman said, not unkindly, "didn't no one tell you? Jameson's gone. Took off north 2 weeks back. Left in a hurry. Don't reckon he'll be back." The words hit her like a blow to the chest. She staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. "Gone," she whispered. But I came all this way. He wrote to me. He asked me." Another man, his voice low and gruff, cut her off. "Ain't no use crying over it. Jameson was always restless, never stayed in one place long. You were fooled, that's all. Best pack yourself back east." The crowd murmured agreement. A few turned away, disinterested. Others stared at her openly, curiosity mingling with judgment. To them, she was a pitiful figure, a bride without a groom, a woman without a place. She sank back onto the boardwalk, her whole body trembling. The matron shook her head again and muttered, "These poor girls. Always thinking the West holds salvation, ends up holding nothing but sorrow." The young woman clutched her satchel tighter, as though it were her last lifeline. The thought of returning east stung her worse than Jameson's abandonment. There was nothing left for her there. No family, no future. That was why she had agreed to this marriage in the first place. And now, even that fragile dream had been snatched away. Tears blurred her vision until the world became only shapes and shadows. She tried to breathe, but each breath came shallow, ragged, as though her corset was squeezing the very air from her lungs. The letters in her satchel mocked her with their empty promises. She wanted to tear them to pieces, to scatter them in the dust, yet she couldn't let them go. They were the only proof that once someone had wanted her. As the crowd dispersed, whispers trailed behind like barbed wire. Poor thing. Best she learn quick. This land don't care about tender hearts. Won't last a week out here. Alone again, she pressed her face into her hands. The sun had slipped fully. Behind the horizon now, painting the sky in bruised purples and fading gold. Night crept in, and with it, her fear deepened. It was then, when she was certain no one in the world cared, that she felt the weight of someone's gaze upon her. Steady, unwavering. She lifted her head, eyes glistening with tears, and across the street she saw him, the Apache man, still watching, still silent. For the first time since her arrival, she did not feel mocked. She did not feel pitied. In his dark eyes, she saw something different. Recognition. As if he knew exactly what it meant to be abandoned. And though no words passed between them, a flicker of hope stirred inside her chest. The night had deepened, and the dusty main street of the town grew quieter. The saloon still roared with drunken laughter, but the rest of the settlement lay hushed, shutters drawn, lamps glowing faintly through thin curtains. The young woman sat on the boardwalk outside, her trunk still at her feet. Every now and then, she brushed at her face with the corner of her sleeve, but the tears refused to stay gone for long. Across the way, in the dim light of the livery stable, the Apache man leaned against a wooden post. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding yet oddly unobtrusive. He had been there most of the evening, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. To the townsfolk he was simply the Indian, a man they tolerated on the edges of their settlement, but never welcomed into the fold. But to her, in this moment, he was the only soul who wasn't averting his eyes. She shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, pulling her bonnet lower. For so long she had been warned about men like him, The stories back east painted Apaches as ruthless and wild, savages who could not be trusted, and yet, when she dared glance back at him, she saw none of the cruelty she had been taught to fear. His eyes were steady, calm, as if carved from the same earth he stood upon. The door of the saloon swung open suddenly, spilling light and laughter into the street. A pair of cowhands stumbled out, bottles in hand. Their eyes fell on her, and one snickered. "Well now, what have we here? A bride without a groom." The other cackled. "Don't reckon she'll be too picky tonight." Her heart lurched. She pulled her satchel close, shrinking against the wall. The men took a step toward her, the sour stench of whiskey trailing with them. That was when the Apache moved. He stepped out from the shadows of the stable, his boots striking the dirt with measured weight. His posture was straight, his stride purposeful, and though he said not a word, his presence alone was enough to halt the cowhands. They exchanged nervous glances, their drunken grins faltering. "Leave her," he said at last, his voice deep, calm, carrying a quiet authority. The men scoffed at first, one spitting into the dirt. "Ain't none of your business. The Apaches." Gaze did not waver. "It is now." Something in his tone, something unflinching, made them hesitate. They muttered curses under their breath, but finally turned back toward the saloon, their bravado dissolving the farther they went. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving the street quiet again. The woman sat frozen, her breath caught in her chest. She lifted her gaze slowly to the man now standing only a few feet away. He was taller up close, the lines of his face carved by both hardship and resilience. His dark hair, bound in braids, glistened faintly under the lantern light. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, he gave a single nod, neither demanding nor dismissive, before turning to walk away. "Wait," she blurted, her voice barely above a whisper. He paused, half turned back toward her. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant howl of a coyote on the ridge. Finally, she found her voice again. Why did you help me?" He studied her for a long moment before answering, his words simple, almost gentle. "Because you were alone." Her lips parted, but no reply came. Alone. That word struck deep. It was the truth of her life, laid bare by a stranger. And yet, for the first time since stepping off the coach, she didn't feel entirely abandoned. The night wrapped the town in a heavy, quiet blanket, broken only by the occasional creak of a wagon wheel in the distance or the howl of a coyote on the mesa. The young woman remained huddled on the boardwalk, her hands pressed tightly against her satchel, her body trembling from a mixture of cold and despair. Each time she thought of returning home, she imagined the empty streets, the disapproving faces, and the hopelessness that had driven her west in the first place. And yet, here she was, stranded, abandoned, and utterly alone. The Apache man's figure appeared once more, moving silently through the shadows toward her. This time he did not speak immediately. He stopped a few paces away, the lanterns casting long, angular shadows across his strong, weathered features. He watched her for a moment, noting the way her shoulders shook, the way her fingers dug into the worn leather of her satchel. "You don't have to hide," he said finally, his voice calm, steady, carrying across the still street. "Not here, not with me." She flinched at the words, unsure if they were meant to soothe or warn. I can't," she whispered, barely audible. "I don't know you. I can't just—" He raised a hand gentle, as though to reassure rather than command. "I know. You don't need to speak if you're not ready. Come, eat, rest. You will not be turned away." Her mind raced. Every story she had ever heard warned her about trusting men like him. Every instinct screamed for her to retreat, to hide, to curl into herself and vanish. And yet, there was something in his eyes, something steady and unwavering, that promised safety rather than harm. Tears welled again, and she wiped at them frantically with the back of her hand. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. She couldn't explain why, but a small spark of hope flickered within her chest. He gestured toward the edge of town, where the faint outlines of his cabin appeared against the horizon. The structure was modest, wooden, with smoke curling gently from a stone chimney, but it radiated a quiet solidity, a home in the midst of the untamed wilderness. The walk felt longer than it was, every step a battle against her fear and exhaustion. She carried her trunk awkwardly, the weight pressing down on her both physically and emotionally. He walked beside her, silent, giving her space, yet offering a protective presence she could not ignore. When they reached the cabin, he pushed the door open, revealing a small interior illuminated by a single oil lamp. The space was clean, orderly, and surprisingly warm. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting a soft glow across the wooden walls. "You can sit here," he said, pointing to a sturdy chair near the fire. "Your things can go there." He gestured to a corner where her trunk could rest. "Eat first. Rest after. We'll talk later." She sank into the chair, her body finally allowing itself to relax in a way it hadn't since leaving the coach. The simple act of warmth, the fire's gentle crackle, the smell of wood smoke, the quiet safety of walls around her, was almost intoxicating. For the first time since she had arrived in this hostile land, she didn't feel exposed. She didn't feel like a spectacle. She didn't feel like the abandoned bride everyone else had whispered about. He handed her a bowl of stew, and she accepted it, the warmth of the food soothing both her stomach and her spirit. Their eyes met briefly across the table, and though neither spoke, there was an understanding there, a recognition that both had been outsiders in this world. Both had known loneliness and rejection. She realized then that shelter was not only a roof over her head. It was the promise of safety, the quiet assurance that someone saw her without judgment. And for the first time that day, she dared to imagine that maybe, just maybe, she could survive here. The following morning, sunlight spilled weakly through the cabin's small windows, glinting off the wooden walls and igniting motes of dust in the air. The young woman stirred in the chair where she had fallen asleep, her body sore from the long journey, her mind heavy with lingering fear. The fire had burned low overnight, but the warmth it left behind made her feel a little less fragile, a little more anchored. She glanced around the cabin. The Apache man moved silently about the space, tending to chores she hadn't even noticed, stacking firewood neatly, checking the small garden outside, sweeping the floor. There was no rush, no hint of judgment, only quiet diligence. Every movement spoke of self-reliance and a rhythm of life that was unfamiliar, yet oddly comforting. Despite the safety of the cabin, fear lingered like a shadow. Memories of the stagecoach, the whispers of townsfolk, the cold realization of Jameson's abandonment, all pressed in on her. She felt vulnerable, as though every moment outside this cabin would return her to the harsh judgment of the world. Her gaze lingered on him as he looked toward the door, noticing the subtle tension in her posture. He didn't speak immediately, allowing her the space to breathe, to acclimate. Then, softly, he said, "It's all right to be afraid." She shook her head, barely managing a whisper. I've never been treated like this before. People stare, they whisper. I don't know how to trust anyone." He nodded slowly, understanding in his dark eyes. "Trust is earned. It is not given lightly." He stepped closer, but kept a respectful distance, his presence both solid and non-threatening. "But here, you are safe. No one here will harm you." Even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at her. The world had shown her cruelty too many times. Abandonment, deception, loneliness. These were familiar companions. And now someone who seemed kind, someone who could protect her, might also hold secrets, might one day turn away. She clenched her satchel tighter, as though it could shield her from uncertainty. Yet, as she observed him, she noticed something that set him apart from the rest of the world. There was no judgment in his eyes, no greed, no mockery, only recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of shared pain. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it struck her with a strange comfort. He understood what it meant to be alone, to be mistrusted, to be forced to hide. Her fear wrestled with this realization. Part of her wanted to retreat, to return to the safety of anonymity on the boardwalk, to hide behind the familiar shame of rejection. Another part, the part that had carried her this far, across endless plains, through endless uncertainty, wanted to reach out, to step beyond the instinctive caution and accept the shelter he offered. The tension in her chest made it difficult to breathe. She could feel her pulse racing as she weighed the choice: remain in fear, alone and unprotected, or risk trust, to place herself in the care of a stranger. Finally, she spoke, her voice quivering. I don't know if I can do this. I've been abandoned so many times before. How do I know I won't be left again? He stepped closer, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze at eye level. You will not be left. Not here. Not by me. His words were simple, yet carried a weight that seemed to anchor her fear just enough to breathe. For the first time since arriving, she considered the possibility that fear could be tempered by trust, that suspicion could give way to hope. She still didn't know if she was ready to let her guard down completely, but for the first time, she felt that perhaps, in this quiet cabin at the edge of town, she might find a place where she could belong. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, unlike anything the young woman had ever experienced. The harsh clamor of the town, with its gossiping townsfolk and relentless scrutiny, seemed to fall away once she crossed the threshold of the Apache man's cabin. Inside, there was simplicity, but also order, a kind of serenity that contrasted sharply with the chaos outside. She began to notice the small, deliberate acts that made this place feel like more than shelter. A broom swept in precise strokes, the firewood stacked neatly by size, the hearth cleaned each morning so that smoke and ash did not linger. Meals were prepared with care, simple but nourishing: cornbread, beans, stews thick with vegetables, and a little smoked meat. Every detail reflected the man's methodical approach to life, an approach born of necessity in the wild frontier, yet softened by an instinct for comfort and care. At first, she observed silently, hesitant to intrude. She thought that perhaps she would only be a guest here, a transient presence until the world outside reminded her of her displacement. But the Apache man welcomed her into the routine gently, without demand or expectation. He handed her a broom and gestured toward the floor with a nod. It helps to move, to feel steady. His eyes held no judgment, only encouragement. Slowly, she allowed herself to participate. Sweeping the floor, she realized the repetitive motion calmed her. Chopping firewood beside him in the yard, she discovered a strange satisfaction in exertion, the rhythm of axe against wood grounding her thoughts. Each simple act carried a weight she hadn't expected. It reminded her that she could contribute, that she could belong, that her presence mattered here. Even the small garden outside, though modest, became a symbol of life and patience. The Apache man showed her how to tend the plants, how to water carefully, how to understand the soil and the seasons. Life requires attention, he said simply. Neglect, and it dies. Care, and it grows. The metaphor was not lost on her. In these routines, she found the first glimmers of peace. She slept better at night, no longer haunted by the prying eyes of the town or the memory of Jameson's abandonment. She began to take pleasure in the quiet moments. The smell of fresh bread, the crackle of the fire, the warmth of a wool blanket. The simplicity of life here did not feel confining. It felt protective. It was a refuge, a place where she could exist without constant fear or judgment. The Apache man, too, shared in this simplicity. He did not speak much of his past, yet she gleaned fragments. A life lived on the edge of two worlds, of being respected and feared in equal measure, of enduring loss and prejudice. In his presence, she felt understood in a way that words could not fully capture. There was no pretense, no performance of social niceties, no expectation of behavior beyond honesty and effort. For the first time since leaving home, she allowed herself to breathe without tension. Even her laughter returned, soft at first, then bolder as she and the Apache man shared quiet moments, sometimes tending the fire together, sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence. The cabin, with its unassuming walls and simple furnishings, became a sanctuary, a place where she was safe to be herself. In this refuge, she realized that belonging might not come from a grand house, a wealthy husband, or a town's approval. It could come from the quiet constancy of another soul, from shared labor, from care without expectation. She began to understand that perhaps, here at the edge of the world, she could rebuild, not the life she had imagined, but one she could truly call her own. The young woman had settled into the cabin with a quiet ease, but there remained an unspoken understanding between her and the Apache man. They did not need to fill the silence with chatter. The rhythm of their shared days spoke louder than words ever could. Yet in these quiet moments, she began to see him not only as her protector, but as someone whose life mirrored her own in ways she had never expected. He had always seemed self-sufficient, strong, and unyielding. Yet she noticed subtle traces of isolation in the way he moved and spoke. There were glances toward the horizon, a brief shadow of longing in his eyes, as though he carried invisible burdens no one else could understand. She realized that he too had been cast aside by the world. The townsfolk wary of him, the outsiders, suspicious of his kind, the frontier life harsh and unforgiving. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire and gold, she ventured to ask him about it. "Why? Why do you live out here alone?" she asked softly, trying to keep her voice steady. He paused, sharpening an axe with slow, deliberate strokes. The steel gleamed in the fading light. "Because," he said at last, "people do not always understand what they see. They fear what is different, and fear can drive them to hurt, to exclude, to judge." His words were quiet, but they carried a weight that made her heart ache. She nodded slowly. The understanding between them deepened. Her own life, uprooted and betrayed by Jameson's abandonment, had been filled with rejection and misunderstanding. She had been judged for her origins, her age, her helplessness, and her choice to seek a new life in a strange land. Now, looking at him, she saw that they were not so different. Two souls made outsiders by circumstances beyond their control. In the days that followed, the small acts of trust grew between them. She helped with chores, prepared meals, and tended the garden, while he taught her the ways of the land, how to recognize the subtle signs of weather, how to gather herbs, how to hunt when necessary. Each lesson was a quiet acknowledgement of shared reliance, a bond formed not through words, but through mutual respect and understanding. Sometimes they would sit together outside the cabin in the early evening, watching the mesas stretch endlessly into the horizon. The air was filled with the scent of sagebrush and the distant cry of coyotes. She would speak hesitantly about her past, her lost family, the journey west, the abandonment she had suffered. He would listen, silent, his eyes reflecting her pain without judgment or pity. In turn, he would share fragments of his own story, A childhood lived on the margins, the burden of mistrust from others, and the quiet strength he had cultivated to survive. It was in these moments, in the soft twilight, that she realized the depth of their connection. Both had been forced into isolation by the world's harsh judgments. Both had been abandoned in one way or another, and both now were finding solace in each other's presence. She began to see that their shared outsider status was no longer a curse, but a bridge. Their experiences, once a source of loneliness and pain, had created a space for understanding, empathy, and perhaps even hope. In a world that had rejected them, they had found each other. By the time night fell, she felt a strange sense of belonging she had never known. She no longer feared judgment, for in his presence there was only acceptance. The cabin was no longer just a refuge from the world. It was the beginning of a new life, one shaped not by abandonment or fear, but by mutual trust and recognition. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she was seen, where her pain was acknowledged, and where she was no longer alone. And as she looked across at him, she realized that perhaps two outsiders, united by circumstance, could create a home together in a world that had long denied them one. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing sunrise, the young woman and the Apache man grew closer in ways neither had anticipated. What had begun as cautious interaction, she observing, he guiding, blossomed into a rhythm of companionship built on trust, understanding, and quiet laughter. The cabin no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It had become a space where their lives intertwined, where small gestures carried profound meaning. Their bond began with simple routines. She learned to prepare the evening fire just as he liked it, arranging kindling and wood in a pattern that encouraged warmth and longevity. He taught her how to braid ropes from raw fibers and mend clothing using the materials at hand. Every lesson, every shared meal, every shared moment of silence strengthened the fragile trust between them. One afternoon, she struggled to lift a heavy sack of flour from the corner of the cabin. Her arms trembled, and her legs threatened to buckle beneath the weight. He was beside her in an instant, steadying the sack and offering a quiet, "You don't have to do it alone." Her heart caught in her chest at the simple statement. It wasn't patronizing or commanding. It was a reassurance that she had a place here, that her efforts mattered, and that she could rely on him. Laughter soon found its way into their days. Sometimes it was small and shy, escaping her lips when she tripped over the uneven boards while carrying water. Other times, it was loud and unrestrained, filling the cabin as he shared stories of his past adventures, moments of humor hidden within hardship, of resilience cloaked in simplicity. Each laugh was a bridge, drawing them closer and smoothing the edges of loneliness that had defined their lives for so long. Even the quiet moments held weight. They would sit outside at dusk, the sky painted in hues of amber and violet, listening to the distant calls of coyotes and the whispering wind across the plains. Words were not always necessary. The presence of another soul who understood your pain, who had walked a parallel path of isolation, was enough. She found herself leaning slightly closer to him, unconsciously seeking comfort in the steady cadence of his breathing and the warmth of his presence. Through shared labor and companionship, she began to trust not just him, but herself. She realized that her fear of abandonment, so ingrained from years of disappointment, was slowly loosening its grip. He never demanded her affection, never forced her trust. He simply offered constancy. And in the consistency of his actions, she found safety, hope, and, gradually, a deep sense of belonging. At night, as she lay in the small corner of the cabin he had prepared for her, she reflected on the transformation within herself. Where fear had once dominated, there was now anticipation for the day ahead. Where despair had held sway, there was now quiet hope. The bond forming between them was more than companionship. It was mutual healing, the gentle intertwining of two wounded souls who had found refuge in each other. Their connection was not born of grand gestures or spoken vows. It was forged in the quiet constancy of daily life. In meals shared, chores completed side by side, the careful teaching and learning of survival in a world that had rejected them both. Each day, each act of kindness and each word of understanding reinforced the bond until it became undeniable. They were no longer merely two outsiders coexisting. They were partners in life, guardians of each other's hearts. And as she drifted to sleep that night, the flickering fire casting shadows on the walls, she allowed herself to smile, a full, unguarded smile. For the first time in years, she felt seen. She felt understood. She felt, finally, that she belonged. Life at the cabin had grown into a comforting rhythm, yet the world beyond its walls was less forgiving. The small frontier town, with its narrow-minded gossip and sharp whispers, did not take kindly to the sight of the young woman and the Apache, man together. Even from a distance, their growing bond had begun to draw attention, and attention, in a town built on suspicion, was rarely harmless. It started with subtle glances. She noticed women in long skirts pausing mid-step, staring as she carried firewood or tended the garden. Men in wide-brimmed hats would linger near the saloon doors, exchanging low murmurs, their eyes flicking toward the cabin's edge where the two outsiders worked side by side. Whispers floated through the air like dust. She's gone over to his side. He's led her away from civilization. No good can come from this. One afternoon, as she walked into town for supplies, she felt the weight of their stares. Conversations hushed when she approached, doors shut quietly, and children were hurried away by their mothers. Every step was a reminder that the town judged her for her choices, that her association with him, a man they considered other, was seen as scandalous, even dangerous. Rumors grew louder when she returned with baskets of provisions, her companion walking beside her in quiet dignity. Some men muttered about stealing a white woman, as if ownership and control were rights they had over her. Others whispered about the threat he posed to the town's fragile moral order. She could hear fragments of conversations. Best she learn what's proper. He'll ruin her life. They don't belong together. Fear gripped her chest. The young woman realized that leaving the cabin meant exposing herself not just to prying eyes, but to potential danger. Yet remaining inside could not erase the world outside. The judgment, the whispers, the threats. They all lingered at the edges of her sanctuary. And though the Apache man had offered her protection within his walls, the town's disapproval was a weight she felt pressing on her very soul. That evening, as the sun dipped below the mesas and painted the sky in bruised oranges and purples, the tension reached its peak. A small group of townsfolk, emboldened by numbers and liquor, approached the cabin, their intentions veiled behind feigned concern. They demanded she leave, telling her that no good could come from remaining with him. They questioned his honor, his character, his very right to exist among them. The Apache man stood at her side, calm yet firm, his presence a solid wall between her and their hostility. "She will not leave," he said, voice low and unwavering. "You have no right to command her life. She chooses for herself." The townsfolk were taken aback by his defiance, but the tension remained thick in the air. They spat insults, shouted warnings, and accused her of foolishness. Yet she did not retreat. She found herself standing taller, emboldened by his protection and the truth she had come to accept. She had agency, she had choice, and she would no longer allow fear or judgment to dictate her actions. As the group eventually dispersed, muttering threats and curses, she turned to him, gratitude and admiration mingling with a newfound strength in her gaze. The experience had been harrowing, but it had solidified what she already felt deep inside, that safety, trust, and belonging were not given by the world. They were earned, cultivated, and fiercely protected. In that moment, she understood the ice-to-ice truth of their bond. The cabin was more than shelter, and he was more than protector. Together, they had created a haven against prejudice, a space where love and respect flourished despite the world's hostility. And as the stars began to glitter overhead, she realized that their shared courage had become a force stronger than the whispers of disapproval, a quiet declaration that they would face the world united, unshaken, and unafraid. Night had fully settled over the mesas, the sky a deep velvet, scattered with countless stars. The wind whispered gently through the cabin's cracks, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and distant wildflowers. Inside, the young woman and the Apache man sat near the fire, its soft glow illuminating their faces. Silence had fallen between them, not the awkward, uneasy kind, but the calm, comfortable quiet that only grows between two people who understand each other deeply. She looked across at him, her hands folded in her lap, her heart still racing from the confrontation with the townsfolk earlier. The anger, suspicion, and judgment they had faced together had left her both shaken and strangely empowered. In him, she had found a shield, not just against the world, but for herself, a mirror reflecting strength she hadn't known she possessed. He noticed her gaze and offered a small, reassuring smile. It wasn't a smile meant to charm or impress, but one that carried warmth, acknowledgement, and sincerity. "You do not have to pretend with me," he said softly. "You do not have to hide who you are, your fears, your tears, your doubts. None of it." She felt the words settle deep within her, comforting and grounding. All her life she had been expected to perform, to be polite, proper, and small. She had hidden pain, fear, and vulnerability from the world for as long as she could remember. Yet now, in the warmth of this simple cabin, with the man who had become both protector and companion beside her, she realized she could let go. She could be seen, fully, and without judgment. I've never had anyone say that to me before," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "No one has ever allowed me to just be." He leaned back slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Unwavering. Then hear it now. You do not have to be anyone but yourself with me. You are safe. You are seen. You are enough." The weight of his words, simple as they were, lifted a burden she had carried for years. Tears gathered once more. But this time, they were not solely from grief or fear. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. She allowed herself to reach out and place her hand over his. The gesture, small and tentative, felt monumental. It was a bridge between two lives marked by loneliness, an unspoken acknowledgement of trust and shared understanding. They remained in that quiet intimacy for some time, the fire crackling gently between them. Words became unnecessary as the bond they had nurtured through days of shared labor, quiet conversations, and mutual care grew stronger. In each other, they had found something the world had denied them: acceptance, companionship, and a sense of home. Eventually, she spoke again, her voice firmer now, carrying determination alongside vulnerability. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, "but I know that here, with you, I am not afraid, and for the first time in my life, that feels like enough." He nodded, his grip gentle but certain. "Then we face it together," he said. "Whatever the world may say or do, we do not falter. We stand side by side. You will never have to face it alone." For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach in tears, she allowed herself to believe in a future. One not dictated by abandonment or fear, but shaped by trust, respect, and love. The cabin, the fire, and the vast wilderness beyond became more than a refuge. They became the foundation for a life they could build together. As the stars shimmered overhead, they sat in silence once more, hands intertwined, hearts steady. Two lost souls had found each other against the world's judgment. And in that quiet moment, the vow was unspoken but unmistakable. They would face life together, with courage, trust, and unwavering acceptance. In the safety of each other's presence, the tears of that first day felt distant, replaced by hope, belonging, and the quiet, enduring strength of a bond forged in both hardship and kindness.